Donald Rumsfeld is here. He served twice as Secretary of Defense and presided over the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. He has now ventured into a new territory as an app developer. Last week, he released a game called Churchill Solitaire. It is a version of Solitaire played by the British Prime Minister during World War II. Here's a look at the trailer for the game.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender.
For decades, the game that Sir Winston Churchill played to sharpen his wits and steel his nerves was lost to the ages. Now, the most diabolical version of Solitaire ever devised has been brought to life for a new generation. Churchill Solitaire will keep you coming back, battle after battle, deal after deal, until victory is won. Challenge your friends and family, compete against thousands worldwide, and using skill and cunning, advance through the ranks to become Prime Minister. Do you deserve victory? Play now for free in the App Store.
Never give in.
I am pleased to have Donald Rumsfeld, app developer, back at this table. Who would have believed this could be?
I know, at 83 years old, I had to learn what an app was before we could do this.
So take me to the story. You were the NATO ambassador.
I was U.S. ambassador to NATO in Brussels, Belgium in 1973 and 4. And there was a very senior Belgian diplomat there named André de Stark. And he had been the private secretary to Paul-Henri Spaak and to the King of the Belgians when they were in exile in London. Mm-hmm. And in that capacity, during World War II, and the Nazis occupied Belgium, and he became a confidant of Churchill's, a kind of a protege.
Because he was like 29 years old.
Very young. And Churchill took to him, apparently, and taught him this game of solitaire with 2 decks, and they had miniature cards because your eyes span couldn't take big cards. And when we were at NATO together, we'd travel and go to Turkey and various places in NATO countries, and he taught me this game. And I've played it ever since 1973, and enjoyed it.
And how good are you?
Oh, who knows? My wife and I play every day or two.
Every day or two?
In the morning, after breakfast or something, we'll play a game.
Now.
Yeah, I'm retired, and we compete, and we keep track of who's the points.
We or you?
Well, I do, yeah. And it would be ungracious of me to even comment on who's ahead.
You're ahead. And you have commented. So what is it about the game that makes it so interesting for you? Because you are wrapping it around the idea that it is great to teach strategy. Solitaire teaches strategy.
Well, it is so complicated, and as opposed to regular solitaire with 2 decks, and instead of 7 piles, you have 10, and then you have 6 cards up above. And you have to get those cards on the aces up above. Right. You can't pull them down. And to do this effectively, you've got to be thinking 3, 4, 5 plays ahead, and you have to anticipate and think about whether it's better to turn over one of the cards and know what that's going to be, or to take a card from up above. And it's a delightful game. It's challenging. It's vastly more complex than normal solitaire.
Well, is it more complex than bridge?
I am not a skillful bridge player.
But you've played.
I've played.
And you know, a lot of smart people think it's the
terrific
the intelligent game.
I would rank it up there with bridge.
Yeah.
And the other thing you can do, now that, you know, in the old days, we didn't have iPads. You may not remember that, a young fellow like you.
Yes, that's right.
But they didn't exist. And
now you're a devotee of iPad.
Now you can compete with someone else via the Internet.
Yeah.
On this game.
Well, people like Warren Buffett play bridge on the Internet all the time.
Exactly.
You know, and Bill Gates, and they can play in different cities and all that.
No, and here you can email a challenge and take the same deal and have someone else play that deal, see how many points they get up and how fast they can do it.
André de Stark said once something that I thought was rather interesting. What one needs in life are the pessimism of intelligence and the optimism of will.
He said that to me, and I remembered it and thought about it, and he's quite right. He was an enormously skillful diplomat. He was the dean of the North Atlantic Council, the 15 countries that were in it back in those days, and was an enormous help to me as the U.S. ambassador.
There are levels in this game, and you can, and it really traces Churchill's career. So when you become prime minister, you're playing at the top level.
Well, in the back of my mind, I've got the thought that maybe you're right. You start out as a Sandhurst cadet,
right,
and then you proceed through all the ranks to finally prime minister. However, later he was made Sir Winston Churchill, and maybe someday we ought to have Sir Winston Churchill even above the prime ministership.
And what would you think of a man who would oppose making Winston Churchill a citizen?
I didn't oppose it.
You didn't?
No.
What did you oppose? People are writing that.
Yeah, and it's
and
not
that
true.
Some letter or something.
Yeah, I doubt that anyone can suggest that. I think I may have raised the question. How do we
want to start doing this? Was the insinuation?
You've got to be careful doing it. And my recollection is that we now have three. One was the Marquis de Lafayette,
right,
which I understand, Winston Churchill, which I certainly understand, and I think another was Raoul Wallenberg.
Yes.
And I don't know if there are any others. I remember being in Congress at some point.
So if it's done rarely,
exactly,
it's okay with you?
Yes, it has to be something very special. Yeah.
What was it about Churchill, you think, that made him? Because if you look at where he was when he went from the Admiralty to Prime Minister,
and a marginal career in the Admiralty.
Exactly. And had been in the wilderness in the 30s.
Exactly.
He said when he entered 10 Downing, I think 41, everything I have done has prepared me for this moment.
Yeah.
Everything I have done.
And he was right.
Yeah.
And he did a superb job. And, of course, I was alive during that period. And I remember the voices of Churchill and the voices of Franklin Roosevelt. My father was out on a ship in the Pacific during World War II, and I was living in San Diego, and it was a Navy town. And those figures were important.
People say that what he had in the end, Edward R. Murrow said he mobilized the English language. But people say in the end, he instilled in first Britain, later the world, never give in.
Yes.
Right?
And that's part of our trailer in this. And it's good. It's a good thing for people to be linked to history, I think, and to hear his voice and to have those connections.
Let me talk about two things about it. One, and then I want to move off Solitaire and this app. One is the notion that there's a Devil 6, right? That's part of the game and part of the challenge. Two, there's something you have called, one, a hint and a redo.
And in life, a hint would be if I picked up the phone and called Andre de Stark and asked him, something's coming up in NATO. What do you think about this? And talk to someone who's got more experience, done things that you haven't done, and can give you some advice. On the other hand, undos, there are very few undos in life.
You can't undo it.
No.
You can't rewrite it.
No. So the undos are there. And the hints are there. I think they should be used very sparingly.
Suppose Michael Bloomberg called you up and said, a lot of people want me to run for president as an independent. You've had experience in national government at different levels. You were in the Congress. You were chief of staff at the White House. You were Secretary of Defense. You served as ambassador to NATO. What should I do? How would you hint?
Oh, my goodness. That's something only he can figure out, and he has to go with his stomach, what he feels good about.
Is it doable?
Well, I've thought about that, and it seems to me that our country, one of the things great about our country is we're a two-party system. We're not a multi-party system. And smaller countries can be multi-party, but I think our country...
like Israel, for example.
Yeah. A small party can pull governments down in certain nations in Europe.
We're not talking about...
And in our country, that wouldn't be a healthy thing to have permanently multi-party system. So I think if anyone ever runs for as an independent, that probably what they ought to do is announce that if and when they're elected, they will serve as a Republican or a Democrat.
In the interest of the two-party system.
In the interest of the two-party system. Because I think fracturing our party system would be unhealthy for us.
Can you imagine that if it's thrown to the House of Representatives, where they select the president, the Senate selects the vice president, that necessarily Republicans are in the majority wouldn't necessarily vote for their candidate, but might find in Mike Bloomberg, a successful businessman, a successful politician as mayor, someone that they in their conscience might vote for whatever reason they didn't think that the Republican candidate had enough experience, had enough temperament, had enough judgment.
Or the Democrat.
Or the Democrat as well, absolutely.
Yeah. It seems to me what will happen is there'll be discussions and debates and there'll be a lot of maneuvering, and that process is designed to be political in nature, and people will talk and deal and make arrangements and discuss things and find out what will happen if this happens and what will happen if that happens. And it's unpredictable.
This Politico magazine had reported this weekend about a now declassified report that you sent to General Richard Myers, but which had been put together by someone on the, as I understand it, on the Joint Chiefs staff.
Yes.
So someone working for General Myers, who's been on this program a number of times,
good man,
created a document about what the intelligence taught them about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
Right. My recollection is I think I asked for information about
the Joint Chiefs to do that, and so he had somebody prepared, and he sent it to you.
Well, the Joint Chiefs participate in all the interagency intelligence meetings with the Central Intelligence Agency, the Director of Central Intelligence, the State Department's intelligence, the National Security Council staff,
NSA.
And they share all of that.
Right.
And that information had undoubtedly been part of the original process. I mean, they weren't going to. There were no secrets as to what was going on. Everyone was talking to everyone, and the person responsible for pulling all those threads through a needlehead was George Tenet, the director of Central Intelligence, and he did that process and then presented it to the National Security Council
even though it
and
came
to the
from
president.
A staff member to put it together from Richard Myers.
Sure. What they knew.
Why wouldn't the CIA put it together then if George Tenet's going to put it all together?
That was his responsibility, but each agency was asked what they knew, how they knew it, feed that information in, and all of that information came in to the Director of Central Intelligence staff, and they then presented it to the President, taking account of all of that.
There are two questions that come out of this, and it's recent news. One is, quote, our knowledge in the report, our knowledge of the Iraqi nuclear weapons program is based largely, perhaps 90%, on analysis of imprecise intelligence.
Well, one thing to keep in mind is if something is intelligence, it's not a fact. If something's a fact, it's a fact.
Right.
If something's intelligence, it means there's judgment involved. It means that a lot of conflicting facts and information are brought together. That is not a surprise at all because we knew that Saddam Hussein had used chemical weapons against its own people. We knew that he had used chemical weapons against his neighbors, the Iranians.
But I think most people, and I could be wrong about this, would suggest that the fear was that Saddam had nuclear weapons.
I don't think there was a fear that he had nuclear weapons, that he had chemical and biological weapons.
Okay, why did we go to war then?
Well, the president looked at all the intelligence from the Central Intelligence Agency and made a judgment that the threat from Saddam Hussein and his opposition to the UN resolutions were sufficient, that was the appropriate thing to do. He briefed the Congress. He briefed the UN. Colin Powell took all that information, spent days analyzing it.
He went out to Langley and they took him through the course. A
seasoned person in dealing with intelligence products, and concluded what he said at the UN. Now, after the war, a man named Charles Delfer, I remember what he said was they still had the facilities to do chemical and biological weapons. They still had the precursors, and they still had the cadre of people who had the know-how, and that it would be a matter of some weeks, not years, for them to reconstitute their chemical and biological program. I don't remember saying what you said about nuclear.
Know-how. Let me just stay with this point, though, and have you, because it says interesting things about how government operates. You said this is big. When you saw the report, you said this is big.
Well, anything that was like that seemed to me ought to be a part of the process, and it was.
Okay, but then it was, but you didn't call up Colin Powell and say,
I wasn't in charge of intelligence.
But you were the Secretary of Defense, and you saw something that's big. Wouldn't you want to share it immediately?
We did. They did. You can be sure of that.
The CIA took this report. You didn't feel a responsibility to pass it on to anybody because you assumed the CIA was.
I didn't assume anything. I knew that the Central Intelligence Agency was having meeting after meeting after meeting with people from defense, the civilians, the military staff, from the CIA, from the State Department, and all of those people were doing that. That was their job to do. That was the statutory responsibility of the Director of Central Intelligence.
How concerned are you about how Iraq has turned out?
Oh, my goodness. You know, repression works. A brutal dictator can impose his will and kill people and imprison people. And once that's gone, free people are free to do good things, and they're also free to do perfectly horrible things. And disorder in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq, and in many countries in that part of the world is serious problem for the world. I mean, we're facing a long struggle against radical Islamists.
What would be the Rumsfeld plan with all of your time at the Defense Department? What would you have America do?
Well, the first thing to do is to recognize that this is not going to be won with bullets over time. You're going to have to. The basic principle of economics is if you want more of something, you reward it. Right. If you want less of it, you penalize it. And what has to be done is the United States is going to have to provide leadership in the non-Muslim world and in the Muslim world to get a coalition of people who are willing to find ways to squeeze off the money that is going to them. Find the financiers and
where do you
see
think
that
the money's
stops.
coming from?
It's coming from a lot of, basically in that region.
Yeah. In other words, you think governments are providing...
Not governments, no, people.
People, okay. So not government, but people from that region, from Saudi Arabia and from other countries. Largely, are providing the financial support for ISIS.
You've got to squeeze off their recruiting skills.
Right.
And one of the ways to do that is to find out where the people are flowing from.
Right.
But the second way to do it is to make sure that it becomes increasingly clear that it's painful to be recruited, that they're not going to win.
You pay a price?
Yeah, that they're not going to win. A lot of people want to be on the winning side.
That's why people say that the caliphate and the territory they hold is a recruiting symbol for them.
Exactly. It's a victory. It's we're the winners. We're on a roll.
So here's interesting. Donald Rumsfeld, who was Secretary of Defense, steps forward to say we have to do a lot of things in terms of using other assets like social media, like economics, like intelligence, rather than beating them on the battlefield.
Exactly. You're not going to win it by a terrorist can attack any place at any time using any technique, and it's physically impossible to defend every place at every moment of the day or night against every conceivable terrorist technique. You can't do it. Therefore, you have to find ways to dissuade them. Normal deterrents don't work. If you're dealing with people who want to die because they believe prepared to die, and if they can be seen as having a crusade, if you'll use the wrong word, a movement that's exciting and that's worthwhile and has value, then they're going to be able to recruit people, and not just in that part of the world. They'll recruit them right out of our country. So they have made the act of being a member of ISIS romantic. Exactly. And you got to stop that by showing it's not romantic. You have to see that it's not going to be rewarded. So here you have Ted Cruz, who says we need to carpet bomb Raqqa, where the headquarters of ISIS in Syria. I mean, is that helpful? Well, I don't know what he meant. I know what I think, and what I think is what I've said. You have to do. We've got to get. Let me give you an example. In Egypt, the leader stood up and talked to the imams in the most important Arab country in the world, in the most important Arab city in the world. Cairo. And he said, this is bad. You've got to see that your people don't do this. It was barely reported in the world. No one stood up and said, by good for you, that's exactly right. And there must have been leaders all over the world who agreed with him, who said, my gosh, he's all alone. Instead of showing support for him, instead of praising that leadership, we didn't. It wasn't carried in our press. It wasn't discussed. And other people must have said, well, I'm not so sure. I'm going to stand up and put a target on my back.
Sisi is also very controversial for some of the tactics he's used and some of the questions of human rights. You know that.
Everybody's controversial. You're not going to get 100% out of any leader in other countries. They have different languages. They have different cultures.
So whatever he's doing, you were saying it's okay with me because it's necessary to achieve his objectives.
I wouldn't say that it's okay with me. What I would say is we live in a big world.
Right.
There are countries that are different than we have. There are different cultures. There are different languages. There are different histories. They have different neighbors. And the idea that everyone has to be exactly like us is unrealistic and nonsensical. In fact, we're still evolving. My goodness, our country's changing.
The argument they also make is, look, it took you a while to get your own democracy.
We had slaves until the 1800s. Women didn't vote into the 1900s.
So you're saying we should give them some slack as to how they developed their own country, and including Iraq.
You can't expect others to be like us because we're not like we were 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and we're not like we're going to be in 50 years.
You're 83 years old.
I am 83 years old. I'm a great-grandfather.
And you obviously have good genes and you can live a long time. But how do you want America to remember Donald Rumsfeld?
Oh, my goodness. I don't get into that.
You've never thought about that?
I don't. Right. I think of people who spend their time worrying about their legacy.
There's no misconception.
They should worry about doing the right thing for the country.
There's no misconception about you that bothers you at all.
What good does it do? All you can do is get up in the morning and do your best.
So, from a position of observing and the party that you have served, who best reflects Donald Rumsfeld of all the candidates?
I don't have any idea. I don't even know half of them.
Tell me this, though. They've been debating for a year.
And I've watched every one of the debates.
So what conclusion do you come to?
My conclusion is that we don't need 4 more years of the last 8 years. That a change in administrations would be a good thing for the country.
So whether it's a Democratic administration or a Republican administration, that would be a change in administration.
One would represent a greater change than the other.
What change do you want to see?
I want to see someone in there who can provide this country and the world leadership. If we create a vacuum in the world, and I believe we have, I think the result of that is that the vacuum gets filled, and it gets filled by people who don't have our values and don't have our interests.
Do you believe that's exactly what Vladimir Putin has done in Syria? He stepped into a vacuum, and now he's a player, and he's at the table.
Well, sure, he's a player, and one of the best things that happened was that the Soviet Union stopped existing, and they were no longer an influence in the Middle East until recently.
But what is your central indictment of the past 4 years that you think is so dramatically in need of a change? Is it America is weak?
Let me give you an answer real quick.
Okay.
What's the greatest threat facing our country? People say, well, it's cyber attacks or it's nuclear weapons in China or Russia.
I'll tell you what most people think it is.
I worry about all the millions of decisions being made all across the globe that we don't know about. It's the policeman's wife or spouse in Baltimore who sidles up to him and says, gee, don't you think it's about time to not be a policeman? It's the parliamentarian in Philippines who sees what's going on by the Chinese and the Spratlys. And the vote comes up in the Philippine parliament, and he says, gee, it's free play. Law of the Sea Treaty be damned. It's okay. The Chinese can do anything they want in our part of the world. Maybe I'll vote with them instead of with the United States or Japan or the West or Republic of Korea. It's the political leader in Indonesia who listens to Al-Sisi's speech in Cairo and sees nobody supports him, nobody says anything, nobody stands up, and he puts a big target right in his forehead. And he's thinking, maybe I should say the same thing. And then he says, well, maybe I won't. Maybe I won't do that. There are millions of decisions being made by human beings all across the globe that reflect what's happening in the globe, in the world, their world.
Would it surprise you to know that the president of Iran has been very vocal about attacking and very vocal about the danger of ISIS?
Well, I was asked the question, what happens if the sanctions are taken off? And I said that Iran will continue and probably have more resources to support terrorism. They're the principal supporter of terrorist organizations.
You mean by that Hezbollah? And
exactly, and Hamas, and they're active doing it. They have used their proxy in Syria for it. So, sure, anyone with any sense is concerned about terrorism, particularly homegrown terrorism, and the fact that he's worried about some of that not being fitting his model is fine. But they are supporting actively terrorist organizations.
Take a look at this photograph. That's you on the right in your business suit. That's a diplomatic suit. In the middle is?
That's Russell Train.
Right.
Yeah, and on the left is Andre Descartes.
And that's Andre.
Yes, indeed.
I should say one last thing about this app, which we started with. All the money.
I think you are sufficiently educable that you could play it.
Maybe.
And you'll like it. It's challenging.
You think I have a capacity to learn?
I have no doubt about it.
I should make this point that you are giving all the profits to this, whatever they may be. You and I think someone else.
Well, the Churchill profits go to the Churchill Foundation in the support of their activities, and mine will be going, if they exist, will be going to military charities.
Good for you. Thank you for coming.
You
Pleasure
bet.
to see you again.
Good to see you.